They called it the last hurrah. Their final camping trip before graduation scattered them across the country. It had started as a freshman tradition, just 5 guys from the same dorm floor who couldn't afford Cancun for spring break. Now, 4 years later, they were back at Bishop Lake for the 4th and final time. Jake stared at the acceptance letter from Stanford's graduate program on his phone, then switched it to airplane mode. No point dwelling on the future tonight. Besides, the others had sworn no grad school talk allowed, especially Tyler, who had been oddly quiet since his MIT rejection last month. The last stop gas and market sat hunched against the gathering dusk like a tired old dog. Its fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered, creating strange shadows that danced across the cracked pavement. The place hadn't changed in 4 years. Same faded beer posters, same broken ice machine, same oddball behind the counter. Good old Edgar, Chris whispered as they piled in. Still looking like a human praying mantis. The clerk pushed his thick black glasses up his nose, the lenses magnifying his eyes to owlish proportions. Edgar had worked there every time they'd stop, always wearing the same brown vest with mysterious stains, always reading the same dog-eared cryptozoology magazines. "Bishop Lake again?" Edgar asked, his enlarged eyes blinking rapidly behind the smudged lenses. His Adam's apple bobbed as he spoke, making him look even more insect-like. "That's the last time," Tyler said, dumping their usual haul of beer and beef jerky on the counter. Edgar's hands trembled slightly as he rang them up. "Might want to reconsider. The lake's been hungry lately." Jake paused, a bag of chips halfway to the counter. "What do you mean, hungry?" "Lost 3 deer last month. Found 'em half dissolved on the shore. And little Amy Carson, that sweet kid, used to come in for popsicles." Edgar's magnified eyes darted between them. "She went missing last summer. They found her bike by the lake, but..." He shrugged, the gesture somehow making him look even more unsettling. "They never found her." Marcus laughed, but it sounded forced. "Man, you tell this story to all the college kids?" "Only the ones I want to see come back." Edgar bagged their supplies with methodical precision. "Lake's got an appetite is all I'm saying. And it's growing." The winding road to Bishop Lake seemed darker than usual, the headlights barely penetrating the thick canopy of trees overhead. Tyler drove slower than normal, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Nobody mentioned Edgar's warning, but they all had gone quiet, the usual road trip playlist playing to an unusually sober audience. A deer carcass lay half hidden in the undergrowth near the turnoff. It looked wrong somehow, deflated, as if something had liquefied its insides. Chris made a joke about mountain lions, but nobody laughed. The lake lay cupped in a valley like a black mirror, surrounded by ancient pines that seemed to lean away from the water's edge. Even in the late afternoon sun, mist clung to the surface in tendrils, as if the lake was breathing. The air here had always tasted different, metallic, almost sweet, with an underlying mustiness like wet stone and decay. Local kids called it lake breath, but to Jake, it had always been nostalgic for their outings. Setting up camp felt like muscle memory. They'd done it so many times before. But as Jake hammered in his tent stakes, he noticed something odd about the ground. The soil was unusually damp, despite no recent rain. It seemed to squelch beneath their feet, as if the earth itself was waterlogged. The twisted pine's branches creaked above them, though there wasn't any wind. Jake watched his friends set up camp, trying to memorize the moment. There was Tyler, methodically organizing gear like he always did, each item in its designated spot. Ryan already working on his second beer, telling the same story about his high school band that they'd heard a dozen times. Marcus checking his phone every few minutes despite knowing there was no signal, a habit from waiting for med school acceptance letters. And Chris, who'd sworn this would be his last camping trip even back when they were freshmen, yet always showed up anyway. They all had their roles worn smooth by 4 years of friendship, but something felt off this time, like actors who've forgotten their lines but were trying to carry on anyway. Maybe it was the way Tyler's laugh seemed forced, or how Ryan kept glancing at the lake when he thought no one was watching. Or maybe it was just Jake, seeing endings everywhere now that graduation loomed. While gathering firewood, Ryan found an old warning sign, the metal so corroded it had turned green, but a few words remained legible. By order of Bishop County Sheriff's Department. Multiple incidents. Stay away from water after dark. The rest of the sign had been eaten away by time and rust. "Hey, check this out," Ryan said, pulling up an article on his phone before the signal died. Apparently this place was sacred to some Native American tribe. They called it the Hungry Water or something. Spooky. Marcus waggled his fingers. Bet they just didn't want their kids swimming here in the winter. Tyler had gotten quiet though. His mom was part Cherokee, and he'd grown up hearing some stories. "My grandmother used to say some waters are hungry," he'd mentioned. But then Chris had thrown an empty beer can at his feet, and the moment passed. As night fell, the campfire crackled, sending sparks spinning into the dark canopy of pine trees above. 5 tents formed a loose semicircle around the flames, their nylon walls glowing faintly in the firelight. Empty beer cans littered the ground like aluminum confetti. "Dude, that's not how quantum physics works," Marcus said, crushing another beer can against his forehead. "You just can't say quantum and pretend it explains everything." "Watch me," Jake replied, tossing another log onto the fire. "Quantum physics is literally why my ex won't text me back. The universe is like observing my depression or whatever." "You're both idiots," Chris chimed in, scrolling through his phone. "We're almost out of beer." Tyler, the unofficial leader of their annual camping trip, stood up and stretched. "Bishop Lake's like 5 minutes away. Go for a swim. Sober up a bit." "Swim?" Marcus laughed. "It's like 40 degrees out, dude." "You scared?" Tyler scrunched his eyebrows. "What happened to Mr. I did a polar plunge last winter?" "Well, that was for charity, you jerk." The lake's surface was unnaturally still, like black glass under the moon. Jake noticed small things at first. How the crickets had gone silent, the way ripples formed in the water without any wind, and most disturbing of all, the complete and utter stillness of everything. Bishop Lake had always been full of life. But tonight, there was only the soft lap of water against the shore, each wave seeming to reach a little further up the bank than the last. But 15 minutes later, they were all stumbling down the trail to the lake, phones lighting their way, passing the last cold beer between them. The water felt warm against their skin, too thick, almost syrupy, and warmer than it should have been. It seemed to cling to them, like it was trying to pull them in deeper. And that's when Jake saw it, At first, he thought it was a reflection of the moon, a pale oval floating on the water's surface about 30 yards out, but the moon was behind him, and what he'd thought was an oval was actually flesh. Wet, glistening flesh that pulsed with each ripple of water. Its skin was so thin he could see the network of veins beneath, thick black purplish vessels that throbbed with unnatural pressure. The creature rose higher, water cascading off its elongated body in thick mucus-like sheets. Where a face should have been, there was only smooth, stretched skin with 2 sunken eyes, but it was the mouth of the thing that made Jake's stomach heave. A perfectly circular opening of pink muscle that continuously flexed and dilated like a pulsing wound. Inside, rows of finger-like projections lined the tube, each one tipped with tiny hooks that gleamed wetly in the moonlight. Its flesh was translucent, but not like glass, more like the skin of a cave salamander, showing everything underneath. Jake could see organs shifting and squirming inside its body, could watch the rhythmic contractions of muscles that shouldn't exist in nature. Its digestive tract was visible through its abdomen, a twisted, writhing mass of intestines that seemed to move independently, like a nest of hungry snakes. As it moved closer, the thing's skin stretched and rippled, forming bulges and depressions that traveled down its length like waves of peristalsis. Where the moonlight hit its body, Jake could see darker shapes moving within, half-dissolved masses that might have once been living things. A deer's skull, stripped clean but still recognizable, pressed against the membrane of its stomach before being pulled back into the darkness of its gut. The feeding tube began to extend, unfolding from its face like an obscene flower blooming in fast motion. The pink muscle tissue glistened with digestive fluids that dripped into the lake, creating small patches where the water hissed and steamed. The inside of the tube was lined with thousands of tiny, writhing cilia, all moving in hypnotic waves, drawing anything nearby closer to that horrible opening. Each movement made it seem to defy physics. Its body could stretch and contract like liquid mercury, but with an organic pulsing quality that spoke of ancient twisted evolution. Bioluminescent spots dotted its flanks, glowing with sickly greenish-blue light that created haunting patterns in the water beneath it. These lights pulsed in rhythm with its breathing, if you could call it breathing. More like the whole creature was one giant lung, expanding and contracting in the water. And when it moved, its body undulated in impossible ways, as if its skeleton, if it had one, was made of living rubber. The water around it seemed to behave strangely, too, becoming thicker, more viscous, as if the creature was somehow changing the physical properties of the lake itself. Small fish that swam too close would slow down, their movements becoming sluggish before they were pulled into the creature's gravitational field, like planets being drawn into a black hole. "Holy shit," Tyler whispered. "Holy actual shit." The thing moved faster than they thought. One moment Chris was there, the next he was gone, with only a soft splash marking his disappearance. No scream, no struggle, just gone. "Get out!" Marcus screamed from the shore. "Get out of the water!" They tried. God, they tried. Ryan made it 3 steps before the tube-like mouth shot out, wrapping around his torso, and Jake watched in horror as Ryan's flesh bubbled and melted on contact, his skin dissolving like wet paper where the digestive enzymes touched him. The tube constricted, and Ryan's body folded inward with a wet crack of breaking bones. Tyler got as far as the shallows before the creature rose up behind him like a wave made of flesh. The feeding tube latched on to his face, those thousands of tiny hooks catching into his skin. Jake could see Tyler's body being broken down through the creature's transparent skin, watching organs and tissue dissolve into a red soup that swirled through the thing's digestive system. The last thing Jake heard before he ran was the wet gurgling sound of Tyler's last breath being sucked through that horrible tube. In his mandatory therapy sessions after the incident, Jake tried explaining how the worst part wasn't watching his friends die. It was knowing that pieces of them were still there, slowly being digested inside that transparent horror, visible through its membranes like specimens in a jar. Sometimes he wondered if they were conscious during those final moments, aware as their bodies dissolved into that organic soup. The therapist suggested PTSD-induced hallucinations. Jake snapped back and suggested that she visit Bishop Lake after dark. The university research team that came to study the lake's unusual properties never published their findings. Their equipment detected massive temperature fluctuations and unexplained chemical changes in the water, but the data made no sense, as if the lake somehow existed in multiple states simultaneously. 3 weeks into their study, 2 researchers disappeared during a night diving expedition. The university quietly withdrew their funding, and the remaining team members refused to discuss what their underwater cameras had recorded. Local historians later found that Bishop Lake hadn't always been a lake. Early settler accounts described it as a small pond, barely visible on maps from the 1800s. But it grew year by year, consuming the surrounding landscape like a hungry mouth, taking bigger and bigger bites. The Native American warnings weren't just about swimming. They were about feeding something that would never stop growing. Now, the Rangers found him there the next morning, curled up in his tent, shaking. They searched the lake for days, found nothing but a few scraps of clothing and Tyler's waterlogged phone. At first, they thought Marcus might have survived, but there was no body. But Jake knew better. He'd seen the video on Tyler's phone, something pale and tubular rising from the water behind Marcus as he filmed. The timestamp showed it was recorded 3 minutes after the others died. They never did find Marcus's body. The investigation lasted 3 months, and Jake told the same story over and over, editing out the impossible parts, until even he almost believed the official version. Almost. The local papers ran stories about the dangers of drunk swimming. Parents used it as a cautionary tale at the nearby college, and life moved on. Jake never went swimming again. Sometimes on rainy nights when he can't sleep, he pulls up the satellite view of Bishop Lake on his computer. The water looks normal from above, just another blue spot on the map. But sometimes when he zooms in close enough, he swears he could see pale shapes moving beneath the water's surface, leaving ripples that spread like hungry mouths opening wide. The lake is larger now than it used to be. Every year the waterline creeps a few feet further up the shore, consuming more of the surrounding forest. And sometimes when Jake checks the local news, he finds stories about missing hikers, dissolved deer carcasses, and strange lights seen beneath the water's surface. Now Edgar still works at the Last Stop Gas and Market. Jake called him once about a year after it happened. The old clerk just listened to his story, then said something that still haunts Jake's dreams. The lake's appetite grows every year, and soon Bishop Lake won't be enough to contain it. The investigation itself seemed cursed. 2 divers from the search and rescue team disappeared during the initial sweep. Their equipment was found on the shore. The underwater cameras mysteriously corrupted. The lead detective resigned 3 weeks into the case, checking himself into a psychiatric facility after claiming he saw faces in the lake's water. Faces he recognized from the missing persons pictures dating back 50 years. His replacement found the case notes filled with the same phrase written over and over. "It's not the lake that's hungry." They tried to develop Bishop Lake once in 2024, some tech billionaire's pet project to turn it into a luxury resort. The construction crews reported equipment malfunctions, unexplained accidents. The lake water kept rising overnight, flooding their foundation work. Then came the disappearances, 3 workers in 1 week. The project was officially canceled due to environmental concerns, but Jake saw the classified report, photos of partially dissolved construction equipment, and soil samples that seemed to digest themselves. A historian at the State University uncovered journals from the original Bishop family, dated 1842. They described how their cattle would go missing near the pond, how the water's level rose despite droughts, and how the eldest bishop child claimed to see angels made of glass dancing on the water at night. The final entry, written in shaking script, simply read, "The pond ate Timothy today. The coal says it's our fault, says we fed it too much, says it's awake now." The shoreline tells its own story. Nothing grows within 20 feet of the water. The soil there is always wet, always slightly warm, as if the lake is digesting the very earth itself. Birds don't fly over it anymore. Even insects avoid it, creating an unnatural dead zone that grows wider each year. The rangers posted warning signs, but they keep disappearing. The metal poles found later, partially dissolved, twisted into impossible shapes, like modern art sculptures made of melted steel in nightmares. In 2024, Dr. Catherine Smith from the Geological Survey Team discovered something disturbing in the lake's sediment cores. The deepest layers, dating back over 65 million years, contained fossilized remains unlike anything in the known fossil record. The creatures in these samples seemed to be colonial organisms. Hundreds of transparent tube-like beings connected by a shared digestive system. But the most troubling discovery wasn't the fossils themselves. It was that they showed signs of degradation consistent with modern bacterial decay, as if they weren't fossils at all, but dormant organisms slowly reawakening. Ancient petroglyphs found in nearby caves told an even older story. The local tribe spoke of a time when star water fell from the sky, burning a hole deep into the earth. The water that filled this wound was different. It moved against gravity. It hungered. It grew. Their shamans called it the mother of hollow things, and claimed it had slept since before the first humans walked the earth, dreaming of the day it would wake and feed again. A classified military report from 1962 recently declassified, detailed a series of tests conducted on Bishop Lake's unusual properties. The water showed signs of quantum entanglement at a macroscopic level, something that should be impossible. More disturbing were the biological samples. The creature's cells didn't match any known domain of life. They existed in a state of quantum superposition, simultaneously dead and alive, solid and liquid. The report was discontinued after 3 researchers experienced what they described as shared nightmares of a vast transparent entity that existed partially in our dimension and partially in others, slowly pulling itself fully into our reality, one dissolved victim at a time. Dr. Catherine's final paper, published posthumously after her disappearance at Bishop Lake, suggested a terrifying possibility, where they weren't dealing with a single creature, but multiple creatures, possibly extraterrestrial in origin, that had evolved the ability to merge into a single massive entity. The lake itself might be a part of its body, not just water, but a diluted form of the creature's own transparent flesh, slowly converting everything it touches into more of itself. Her last recorded words, found on a waterlogged voice recorder near the shore, were chilling. "It's just not getting bigger, it's getting smarter. And I think it's almost fully awake." They found Jake's body in his apartment last week. The coroner ruled it suicide, but the details didn't add up. His walls were covered with satellite photos of Bishop Lake, annotated with calculations showing its growth rate. His computer contained thousands of water samples from different lakes across the country, each tested for the same strange properties he'd seen that night. And in his journal, the final entry read, "I found another one in Montana. The water's starting to change. It's spreading. They're all connected." The CDC quietly maintains a task force dedicated to monitoring what they call anomalous water bodies. Their classified database lists 17 lakes across North America with similar properties to Bishop Lake. Each one is growing. Each one has its own missing persons cases, and each one shows the same impossible readings in deep water samples. Signs of organized cellular activity.